African trade and trade integration. A warm welcome to Bogolo Kenewendo, who is former trade minister from Botswana and a non-resident fellow at the Center of Global Development, senior advisor to the UN on climate change champions. She's also a member of Trade Explorers, and she was named as one of this year's Times 100 Next honorees. We also have Dr. Petina Gappah, a trade lawyer who has been the principal legal advisor to the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. She has worked many years as legal advisor to the WTO, and she is also a famous novelist in her homeland, Zimbabwe. Petina, you were with us a little bit more than a year ago, and I'm delighted to have you back and updating us. So it's such a pleasure to have both of you here today. Let's start with the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is, as you probably know, a flagship of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. And that is Africa's blueprint for transforming the continent into a global powerhouse. It was adopted by the African Union in 2013, and 2063 is then 50 years later. And that's where the name comes from. The African Union includes all countries of the continent, all 55. It has a commission, and the secretariat is Addis Ababa. And as of today, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 44 countries have ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area. Guinea-Bissau did that just a couple of weeks ago. The trade area has a secretariat in Accra, in Ghana, and decisions are taken by the African Union Assembly, which is the heads of states and governments of the member states. Trade under the agreement started almost 2 years ago and is covering a market of 55 countries and 1.6 billion people. So of course it has a huge potential. So we are almost 2 years later. After that, we've had a pandemic, of course, influencing trade in the whole world. But I thought it would be appropriate to update us a little bit on where are we now in the African intercontinental trade. So Bogolo, Petina, why don't you start? You have left the Secretariat now, but you followed it very closely for many years. Please.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and thank you so much to the Peterson Institute for organizing this event. And it's such a pleasure to appear with Bogolo, whom I've admired from afar for a while. So it's such a pleasure to be here. You're absolutely right, Cecilia, to say that the AfCFTA started trade in 2020. But of course, the COVID pandemic interfered with a lot of our plans, as it did with a lot of other world plans. So there was a period of stasis when nothing much was happening, at least in terms of actual trade, but a lot was happening in terms of institution building. So I'll just go through a few highlights just to say where we are, and I think that will get us started nicely. So first of all, we have to put the AfCFTA into its global context. And the best way to do that is by explaining that the volume, for instance, of intra-European trade is about 59%, right? And the volume of intra-Asian trade is about 69%. The situation is rather alarming when it comes to the volumes of intra-African trade. Just 18% of all trade on the African continent happens between and among African states. Why is this? For many, many reasons, to do with history, to do with the fact that African countries tend to export mainly raw materials for which the most lucrative markets are out in the West, trading under preferences, and so on. So the imperative for the AfCFTA is to get African countries to start trading with each other. And of course, we can't all be exporting raw materials to each other. So going hand in hand with trade is the imperative of industrialization. And once you understand that, a lot of what I'm going to say is then put into context, because despite the fact that we have in theory been trading for 2 years, there actually has been very little trade. There has been next to no trade, simply because what we're taking on is a fundamental undertaking, which is not going to happen overnight, with the speed of a light switch. That said, even though there's actually very little trading going on under the AfCFTA, there's a lot that's happening to get trade started. So there's a lot of institution building. There's a lot of negotiation of the agreements, finalizing the agreements on trade in goods, while I was in Accra, for instance, I had the pleasure of working on the rules of origin. So we managed to complete that process. We managed to finalize the additional rules of origin that had not been agreed during the negotiations before the AfCFTA started operating. There's also been a lot of work on the investment protocol. The AfCFTA is as ambitious as the European Union. So there are protocols on trade in goods, trade in services, and there's also an investment protocol. And I believe that's going to be submitted to the Extraordinary Council of the African Union in the next month or so. There's also a protocol on intellectual property rights. There's a protocol on competition that has also been, that is currently being finalized as well. And there's also work that is going on to develop the trade remedies mechanism. And of course, I was working when I was there on dispute settlement, so that work is ongoing as well. And the secretariat itself is expanding. When I was there, we had a very small group of people, and now I believe there are just over 100 staff members who are working on all of this institution building. And as you say, Cecilia, in terms of the membership, there's growth there too, because there are 54 signatories to the AfCFTA agreement. And of those 54, 44 are now state parties who have ratified the agreement. Of course, there are challenges, and we can talk about those in a minute. I think the biggest challenge is that the largest number of least developed countries are on the African continent. And being least developed, as we've seen from the WTO, means that capacities are often lacking. And really, the AfCFTA can only go as fast as its slowest member. But there's no question at all that I believe that the economic sovereignty of Africa is an urgent question, and that is a priority to almost all of the African countries who have signed on to the AfCFTA agreement. So I will start there. I will stop there. And maybe as we carry on with the discussion, I can add to or supplement some of the things that I've said. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that quick update. We will indeed come back to some of these issues because, as you say, there's an enormous potential in intra-African trade. I think the World Bank said as if the trade agreement is actually fully implemented by 2035, it would raise incomes by 9% and lift 50 million people out of poverty. And also the pay raise is estimated to be larger for women as well. Yeah. And investment can grow by 100%. And this would, of course, bring jobs and expertise and build local capacity. Bogolo, you have worked on a daily basis with trade as trade minister for Botswana. You have negotiated intra-trade also with the SADC agreement with the EU. Is there, and as Petina said, there are 54 countries who have signed up, 55 on the whole continent. Is there actually such a thing as an African trade policy? What would be the priorities on a short-term basis? And then, of course, the institution building that Petina referred to is extremely important. But on a short-term basis, now that we are hopefully starting to exit the pandemic crisis.
Thanks, Cecilia. I'm very happy to see you all to be joining Petina and you this morning. And I think she did such a great job of laying out exactly where we are at this moment, because and just coming back to your question, I believe that it's been very clear that the continent has an ambition to trade and increase intra-Africa trade and work on development amongst African countries. And the benefits that you just mentioned, Cecilia, some of them go far beyond the continent. If you look at the contribution and rising of incomes, it's not only in the continent, it's also worldwide. And so there's a very strong significance of having the AfCFTA work for the continent and beyond. And to your question of is there really a trade policy just for the continent, I believe that just by the sign of 54 countries coming together to negotiate and reaching some of the milestones that Petina mentioned, it means that there is interest to have one voice when it comes to trade. And having 44 or so ratify the AfCFTA, it's again another sign. And this is not something new for the continent. You know, these ambitions were set out in the early years of independence, and they have come back. And when they did, within 2 years, the AfCFTA, was ready for signing. And that, I think, is a very strong sign of political will towards the AfCFTA. But the question isn't necessarily only about trade policy, it's also about industrial policy. Because at first we understand there's a broader understanding from member states, of course, that clarity is needed in order to drive more investment into the continent and in order for us to trade better. And so the AfCFTA serves that purpose. But we also, what we need to look at beyond just the trade policy is industrial policy. And we used to talk about this at regional level, at sub-regional level, at SACU and SADC and so forth, that really for us to benefit from trading together, we also have to have an aligned industrial development policy, ensure that we are co-creating and we recognize that not only one country gets the benefit over others. And that those are the issues that still need to be ironed out. We recognize that general welfare gains will be there, but will they be accrued by least developed countries and by small and landlocked countries? Those are still questions that still need to be hashed out. But those have come to us, to the table, and to want to make the AfCFTA work. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, I believe we saw another consignment leaving Kenya to Ghana. You know, it's just small pieces, but when they come together, they show the commitment that exists, not only at political level, but also at a business level, that this is not only an ambition of politics, but it's an ambition and a project of the people.
Thank you very much for this. How do you see this, Petina? Industrial policy, this is something that the whole world is talking about right now. And of course, the needs differ between the different countries and the different continents, and also within Africa. I can imagine that there are different needs. But how is this brought to the table of the AfCFTA? Sorry, this acronym is really hard.
It's a difficult acronym, isn't it?
It isn't. It isn't. It's hard to pronounce. But how is this brought to the table? And because, of course, as Bogolo says so rightly, this can reinforce the institution building and the sort of long-term planning to facilitate concretely actual trade, you know, harmonizing of rules and standardization and customs cooperation, and what you also mentioned, rules of origin and so on. But industrial policy, can it really be made to be a whole continental project, or will this mainly be a national project?
Thank you so much, Bogolo, for that. And thank you, Cecilia, for that question. And I was nodding my head vigorously as Bogolo was speaking, because I agree so much with what she has said, and especially on the issue of industrial policy. I said earlier that the statistics for intra-African trade are rather alarmingly low, because there's only 18% of trade within the continent that moves between the different countries. And that's for the reason that our markets have been externally oriented for the longest time because of the nature of the products that we produce, right? Raw minerals, raw materials, and so on, which are then industrialized, if I can call it that, which are then industrialized elsewhere. So there is no question that without industrialization, there can be no AfCFTA. Because as I said earlier, we can't just be trading raw materials with each other. Beneficiation is going to be absolutely essential to the success of trade in Africa. We need to industrialize. We need to find clever ways of becoming part of the global value chain. You know, we need to, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about that ghastly concept called friendshoring. But it is absolutely I think it's absolutely right what Bogolo said, that there is such a thing as an African trade policy that is common to every one of the 44 state parties and the 54 signatories to the AfCFTA agreement, because it's understood that without industrialization, there can be no intra-African trade.
We'll come back to the concept of friendshoring in a little while. I want to dig deeper into that. But with this said, both of you, where do you start on this? Do you start in Accra with the meetings of the African Union heads of states, or does every country do it individually or regionally, like in the SADC area or ECOWAS or so on, or starting to bring up good examples, for instance, because that is also important, peer reviews and so on.
Yeah, so I think, you know, similarly to where the negotiations started, it has to start at regional level. The successes of the RECs, they build to us the success of the Continental Agreement. And there is a report that was created and just tagging on this industrialization and value chain development path that we've started, Petina. There's a report, I think it was a futures report by UNDP and the AfCFTA that started to highlight some of the value chains that can be developed in order to boost intra-Africa trade. And they're showing that with where the AfCFTA stands at the moment, there can be these 6 areas that can boost intra-Africa trade immediately. And I believe that that is where we need to start looking, where are the opportunities within the RECs that can trade amongst other RECs. That's how you start to build that ambition. It's not, you know, many people think that, and we've had these arguments quite often, that the AfCFTA will be all 54 countries trading with each other immediately. But there are building blocks to it, and we start seeing SACU members trading within the EAC, and then COMESA and so forth. And that is how we start to build. And we need to see some of the value chains development happening regionally and them being created space in other regions. And that is really where I would say we need to start. And that report of the futures, I believe, need to start being implemented. You know, during the pandemic, sorry, Cecilia, during the pandemic, I recall there were really strong calls towards value chain development in the continent and making sure that we are no longer exporting, because we had seen that during tough times, the world closes and we're not ready. And I hope sincerely that that call during the pandemic and the wake-up call that we got is really going to push for more value chain development within the continent, and even developing the supply chain as well within the continent. And then we start thinking about trading with the world.
Petina, yeah.
Yes, if I may jump in there, Bogolo, I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I recall reading during the pandemic is that the volumes of intra-Africa trade actually went up a little bit, because we were sort of selling, you know, PPE, protective equipment to each other, gloves and, you know, ventilators and things like that, because the supply chains had been interrupted, you know, especially because of the very strict and stringent lockdowns from, that China imposed. So the value chains had been interrupted. So it was then necessary to, supply chains had been interrupted. It was necessary to replace those supply chains within the African continent. And as a result, volumes of intra-Africa trade went up. But I really like something you said as well, Bogolo, which is that it's not all countries that are going to be trading all at once, simultaneously. It has to be guided in some way. And I think the RECs are an important part of that process. The agreement talks about the AfCFTA built on the acquis, you know, that's a word we borrowed from you guys in Europe, Cecilia, the acquis of the RECs. So the idea is that the RECs are not supposed to stop doing their work. just because the AfCFTA is there, but rather we are supposed to be using those regs as building blocks to a continental framework. And in that regard, I like very much what Bogolo said about perhaps SACU trading with the EAC. We now have at the AfCFTA a really interesting initiative that I'm personally very excited to hear about. Is being managed by my very good friend, Mohammed Ali, the Director of Trade and Goods, and it's called the Guided Trade Initiative. And what they have done is they have identified 8 AfCFTA state parties that are already trading with each other and that are already going on with, going ahead with that trade. I think it's Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, Rwanda, Mauritius. I believe Cameroon is also there. And what is happening under the Guided Trade Initiative is that where products are already moving between the borders, they are now moving as AfCFTA rules of origin products, which I think is a very interesting way to actually get us to, to have those tiny incremental steps.
Yes, if I can just support that, Cecilia. I believe that by so doing, the examples that Petina gave, we start to send really strong signals to the rest of the world, but also to businesses that are operating within the continent to recognize that the AfCFTA has started moving. And one of the important conversations that we've been having is the private sector needs to feel included in this very ambitious project, that it doesn't only stay within the rooms where the ministers are negotiating, but the minute you start working on guided processes, then the private sector starts to feel that they also have a role to play within this space. And one of the important things is when the money is affected, when goods are traded and they see the movement being better facilitated than in the past, then the confidence starts to grow and we start to see an increase in intra-Africa trade. So those signals are very important, starting within the regions and moving on to the different other regs within the continent.
And if I may also add to that, because I was really hoping that you would get to the private sector conversation. I mean, this is absolutely crucial, Bogolo. You are so right, because we cannot afford to see the AfCFTA and its accompanying protocols as just another, solidarity pact, another reason for African countries to meet in Addis and shake each other's hands. The private sector has to be absolutely vital to the process, because after all, it is the private sector that drives trade. It's the private sector that actually does the exporting and does the importing. And in that regard, Cecilia, one major development that I perhaps should have mentioned at the beginning is the creation of the PAPs. It's a payments platform for African trade, because of course, one of the issues that the private sector has in transacting across borders is currency, right? We transact US dollar, right? Yeah. So the PAP system allows traders to trade in the currency of their country. So in Botswana, it would be the pula. In Zimbabwe, well, to be honest with you, I don't know what it would be in Zimbabwe because we're not quite sure what currency we have. But in Accra, it would be the cedi and
Let's just still say the Zim dollar and hope for
the Zim dollar. Sounds very nice. The Zim dollar. So the idea is that traders would be trading in whatever currency is the one that is in their country, and I think schemes like that, and also the Afrexim Bank has established an adjustment fund for those countries that might need a little bit of help to cushion themselves before fully opening up. So it's small guided initiatives like that I think will get us on the right path.
This is so interesting, and of course, what you say about the private sector and them engaging and really seeing real results on the ground of the efforts that's being done on the political level. But politicians cannot create jobs and growth and investment. They can create conditions, but then of course business has to do it. And does that also sort of trickle down to the society in general, to consumers and civil society groups, etc.? Because we have debates in Europe, but also in US, about people being increasingly skeptical towards trade and free trade agreements and not really seeing what's in it for them. Is this a debate that you also have, or has that not really started yet? I could imagine, as you said, you took the example from COVID, that you started to trade in a different way because you realized that you need some medical equipment urgently and the neighbors had it, or some other African friend, and then new patterns developed quite quickly, which is a positive outcome of this terrible tragedy. Has that trickled down to the general debate, would you say?
Yeah. Cecilia, we cannot talk about trade policy and not think about society. And there is a need first to bring that process to the people and make sure that they understand what free trade is, because there's always that question, well, you're going to open up our borders and we're going to be flooded and we're not going to have industry. We're going to lose our jobs, and that usually brings in the issue of national policies and national laws of how they protect nascent and infant industries that are deemed to provide the very necessary employment, and growth to the country. And what I particularly like about the Secretariat has been doing of late is think about the nexus of the AfCFTA and youth, the AfCFTA and women, and really start to drive and show that there are benefits of and welfare gains to the most vulnerable in the economies. And it takes me back to the issue I mentioned earlier. I am losing my voice very slowly. It takes me back to the point I mentioned earlier of we have to think about, especially when we get to the protocol on investment, about how we equitably drive investment for industrial development, particularly to the least developed countries and the small landlocked countries, so that those do very big discussion, even during COVID, of we need to protect our infant industries, we need to have jobs, and how does the AfCFTA meet those demands? So it's a very, very crucial aspect, and every member state is looking at it.
I'm so excited about this conversation because it really confirms that my next project is worth doing, I don't know, Cecilia, if I've told you that I've traveled on a container ship from Europe to the Caribbean because I wanted to see trade at its coalface. So my next project is I'm actually going to be traveling across the continent to write about trade from bottom up. Sort of like that wonderful book, The Journey of a T-shirt, from the cotton fields to supermarkets in Europe, wherever. So I want to actually write about the border communities and informal traders, because if we, Bogolo is absolutely right, if we don't take care of the young people and women, then there's no African trade to talk about, because so much of African trade is actually driven by the informal sector. So as Bogolo says, it's very exciting that the Secretariat is paying attention now to a possible protocol on youth in trade and women in trade. And at the WTO, they talk about this very fancy sounding gender streaming, mainstreaming gender in the WTO and so on. But I think at the AfCFTA, it's not even about mainstreaming gender. Is about ensuring that the agreements that we negotiate actually benefit the very poorest and the very most vulnerable members of society, and that tends to be the young and women.
That's very interesting. And we're looking so much forward reading that book when you're cozying up with the containers for so long time.
I have to write it first.
Okay, well, we'll talk about it when it's done. But this brings us to this very important subject that I know both of you have been engaged in, and you mentioned it, Petina, women and trade, because of course we know from research that when women are engaged in the global trade economy, especially in developing countries, that trickles down, that actually fights poverty, because women then invest in their families, in health of their children, in school, education, and so on. So that can really change the world. And many women are engaged in small companies in rural areas, and they have to, of course, to be involved and connected to the bigger trading system. And you mentioned that the AfCFTA is engaging in this, and WTO is talking about it, but also a lot of things are being done all over the world in order to try to promote women in trade and to make trade more gender neutral in the way that we know that they are both formal and informal obstacles for women to really engage, and a lot of prejudices. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know, Bogolo, that you have been very engaged in a project here as well. We might have lost Bogolo a little bit, so why don't you start? Oh, are you back? Yes, here you are.
I'm nursing. If she could, Petina, if you could just start. I'm nursing my voice. I'll be back in a second.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll talk about one aspect that I'm very interested in, and it doesn't seem like a women's problem at the face of it, but there's a very big difference between the way you are treated if you enter an African country at a land border, and if you enter an African country at an airport, through an airport, right? The treatment that you get as a passenger in a bus or a car or a truck crossing a border is very different to the treatment you get when you arrive on a plane. And I think that one of the issues that affects women, especially women traders, is, red tape at customs. There's a lot of corruption at a lot of borders where you have to pay off customs officials just to get even just a small suitcase of things through, right? Of course, we can talk a lot about women and SMEs, right? But I want to talk especially about informal traders, because I think informal traders get a lot of unnecessary red tape as they try to move very small consignments across borders. So I think one of the ways that we can benefit women traders is if we have ways of cutting some of that red tape and ensuring trade facilitation, even at that most basic of levels.
Bogolo, is your voice strong enough to comment on this?
Yes. I think Petina is completely right. One of the things that we thought of looking at the time is a simplified trade regime, basically. And we were thinking for every woman, now going back to the informal sector that Petina mentioned, so for every woman that reaches the border, maybe with fresh produce, and you keep them there for a day or two, it is literally 10%, 10 to 25% of their produce being lost. And how can we account for that 25% loss for someone that we know very well that has a direct impact on livelihood? So now we start really broadening the issue beyond just trade to speaking to everyday life. Trade is supposed to help people get to better sustainable livelihoods, right? And that is what we preach. So we would think with a simplified trade regime, can we lower the amount of time that they spend at the borders? Now, thinking more about the SME, the informal traders that are particularly in the fresh produce side, how can we make sure that we are making that process quicker, and then we ensure that the income that is accrued to them also generates value beyond just the day-to-day trading. And you want that to become a sustainable business beyond, just an SME informal trader. So those thoughts, I believe, should be part of what could be in that protocol on women and youth, and really bring it down to the basics. Forget all the fancy technical words that we tend to spend time on. But what really matters for traders, am I going to lose time and produce, and therefore income, because it takes me a long time at the border? Because I have to pay a lot at the border for me to just start trading. And so an STR that particularly looks at that is one way of ensuring that we are empowering and giving agency to women in trade, but to SMEs as well in trade. And once you start looking at enabling and facilitating trade at the basics, even the bigger companies get to benefit.
That's crucial, of course, and it will really change the perception on the spot, on a daily life basis, and thereby also increasing the support and the engagement in this. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned it in the beginning, Petina, there's a lot of discussion now in the post-COVID era, and also we have complicated world. Russia's war in Ukraine is devastating, not particular, of course, for the human suffering it is causing, but also for the global economy and for the discussion in general on globalization. And there's a lot of talks, both in the academic world, but also among politicians about that globalization is slowing down. We talk about de-globalization or re-globalization. And also the US-China conflict is leading to decoupling and autonomous sovereignty or sovereign autonomy, as the European Union is putting it. And one concept that came up in the trade dictionary quite recently is this concept of friendshoring, meaning that you trade, concentrate trade, especially in products that are sensitive and vulnerable, with friends where you can rely on the food supply chains and so on. When I was in public forum in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, and Bogolo was there as well, lots of people, especially in the developing world, expressed a lot of concerns about this concept. How is this viewed from your perspective? You mentioned it, Bogolo, so why don't, Petina, so why don't you start?
Yes, thank you so much, Cecilia. Look, I look at friendshoring from two perspectives, right? The first, as my perspective as somebody who really loves the English language and doesn't want to see unnecessary damage being done to it. It's a ghastly word. I mean, friendshoring, and it's even written as one word. It's absolutely ugly to look at on the page. But of course, more seriously, as a trade lawyer who's essentially a multilateralist, I think it's a very dangerous concept, because we're calling it friendshoring when actually it's something that was there before the WTO, right? We had forms of friendshoring, with the US and the USSR, then with their spheres of influence, your preferred trade partners. It even goes back to, the idea of the most favored trading partner and so on. So it seems to me that friendshoring is not only a hideous word, but it's also a concept that takes us back, and it threatens the multilateral trading system that we've worked so hard to build. By the way, I saw that one of the people in the webinar is Deborah Steger, who was my first boss at the WTO. Hi, Deborah. She taught me all I know about trade. And I think for anyone who really believes in the multilateral trading system, friendshoring would be something that's alarming. Not only does it sort of fly contrary to the principle of comparative advantage, which is the basis on which our trading system is built, but it also means that developed countries get to play favoritism and get to have unilateral foreign policies that can be very damaging to developing countries. One of the cases I did at the ACWL was the drugs arrangements case, in which you guys, Cecilia, the EU, had a preferential trade arrangement under which Pakistan started benefiting as a reward for helping out in the fight against Al-Qaeda after 9/11. But what that kind of friendshoring did, was that it had a devastating effect on India, which is a competitor to Pakistan. So suddenly, textiles from Pakistan were entering the EU market at a much more preferential rate than textiles from India. And that had a distortive effect on Indian trade. And that was considered to be contrary to the GSP because it was discriminatory. But my worry is that if we allow this friendshoring concept to go ahead, we're going to see similar effects where trade is diverted from competitive countries towards those that might not be as competitive in particular products.
Bogolo, what's your view on this? You were nodding.
Completely agree. First of all, what is friendshoring? Well, what is friendshoring? I mean, I know that it's been put out, we are trading with friends with the same values and common agenda. But I thought that we all had a common agenda of multilateralism. This is what we've been defending, particularly when there was a challenge between the US and China. We were all there saying we are for multilateralism. Why is it that now we want to change that tone to make it around friendshoring? And to Petina's point, it can only work towards trade distortions. increasing more trade distortions, increasing distortions on welfare gains and generation. And I also am vehemently against friendshoring. Now, nearshoring. Nearshoring is a different issue for me, because I recognize nearshoring as an opportunity in one way or the other of increasing intra-regional trade, making sure that you're working on value chain development and adding value before you export. And that is something that I feel like could be working for the continent.
Interesting. Well, you both referred to the WTO and the multilateral system. As we know, the multilateral system is not working as it should, and WTO, although there were progress at the last ministerials, but they were rather modest, and we see that the political will to really invest in strong multilateral institutions and strong multilateral further developing rules and so on is not really there. Now we have a very strong, charismatic and new leader for WTO, Dr. Ngozi, also the first woman to lead the organization. And I think she has played an important role in really pushing member countries to make those decisions on fisheries and on easing of the waiver for the pandemic and so on. So she has played an important role, but of course she cannot do it alone. And WTO is in a crisis in that regard. So how do you see, can the African continent be a stronger player in WTO, pushing and working also with allies? I mean, Europe is an ally when it comes to strengthening multilateral rules, and many other countries as well. Is there a way forward there where it could be more articulated, also on the more sort of working forward? We all know the past and the failures of the Doha round. Sometimes there is a tendency to look too much back and not enough forward. So how do you see this? Has this also been discussed within the AfCFTA?
If I may take that question first, I was really hoping that you would come to the WTO at some point, because first of all, I mean, if you want to get things done, ask an African woman, look at Bogolo and I right now. If you gave us just a little bit of the world to run, I think we could do a lot. and I think Ngozi has just done, I think she's brought something that was needed. I wouldn't say that there has been concrete progress, but I think there's an energy and a freshness that has been injected into the WTO that I think is very exciting to see. And I for one, am very excited to see what is actually achieved, because of course we've had the Doha round since Doha basically, and apart from piecemeal things here and there, removing of export subsidies, the trade facilitation agreement, huge win there. We haven't really seen as much being delivered on the agenda as was promised. But I will say something, Cecilia and Bogolo, and dear audience, about the WTO and the AfCFTA. I am 100% convinced that being in the AfCFTA is going to mean a recommitment to the WTO. And I'll tell you why. In the dying days of the AfCFTA negotiations, negotiators couldn't agree on a lot. So you know what they did? They simply referred to the WTO and incorporated WTO agreements by reference. So on customs valuation, for instance, they incorporated the customs valuation agreement. On the TBT, rather than negotiating new disciplines on technical regulations or sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, they simply said, we incorporate the TBT agreement, we incorporate the SPS agreement, trade remedies, same thing. So the WTO regime is now a concrete part of the AfCFTA legal regime. So there is no getting away from the WTO. Nearshoring, yes, Bogolo, but it's nearshoring based on principles already agreed at the multilateral level. And I think that's something that's very interesting that not a lot of people have given enough attention to which is to say that the AfCFTA state parties have themselves recommitted to applying WTO disciplines in their own African nearshored trade regime.
You want to comment on this, Bogolo? I know you've been having a lot of events lately, so probably your voice is totally exhausting. Thank you for being with us anyway.
I want to agree with Petina. she started with a very strong point, and I fully support it. Sorry.
We have to disagree at some point, you know.
Yes, you have to disagree.
Okay, I disagree with Petina. I do not think that African women can do it all. No, you know, I feel like there is a new energy around the WTO. There are a few concerns, though, still around the biasness of the organization and multilateralism not entirely working for everybody and leading towards plurilateral negotiations and so forth, with particular focus avoid issues around e-commerce because that's where the world is going and around digitization. But we shouldn't do so in forgetting the very crucial aspects around the Doha round. And that for me is very important. And I feel like we should see more movement towards development, because if we are not developing, then it becomes very difficult for African states and other developing countries to want to engage in new matters. And this is a fact. We've seen this MC11 collapse because there was no consensus on new issues, while we haven't delivered on the older issues. And But we know nonetheless that the private sector economies will progress without us. And this is something that has happened in different aspects. And I feel like there needs to be a capacity as well towards developing countries in order for them to engage, capacity building, in order for them to engage in the newer issues around digital e-commerce and others that we know will come up. Because the big issue here is we want to start opening up to digital trade, but what is our capability of handling such new digital trade aspects? How is that going to affect our domestic economies? And this one of the things that I felt were very crucial to this conversation was the Ict Ict Readiness Assessment or something of that sort. I felt like in us looking and treating maybe digital trade as we treated trade facilitation agreement would lead us somewhere and help us really focus on development aspects related to digital trade.
That is a very important aspect, because I saw some figures that only 90% of African are engaged in digital shopping or exchange compared to 50% in Asia and Latin America. So of course there is Africa does lag behind in the penetration of the digital economy. So there's a lot to do that. And it's discussions on the e-commerce agreement or the conversations. Of course, this aspect has to be there as well. There are lots of people who have asked questions. I just wanted, before we I'll read out some of the questions, and they are to ask about China. Many African countries are involved in the Belt and Road. There are huge investment. This is creating projects, but also a lot of debt. Is this the way forward, or is there a wariness about the strong Chinese dependence? And is there an alternative? Both the EU and the US are trying to find alternatives to this and engaging with Africa. And this is taking a new development now when the COVID crisis started to fade out. Is this something that you discuss in the AfCFTA context, or more on an individual basis?
You know, Cecilia, I always find this question very interesting. Why is it only that African countries are expected to choose when the US itself can trade with China and with Europe? Like, why is it that there's always a question around, oh, is there a strong dependency of African states on China, when we know there's a strong dependency of the US with China? You know, and when we, okay, sorry, just a second.
I'm sorry about your voice. I know you've been speaking so many, yeah.
I can read.
You got a break, Petina. Yes.
I'm going to develop that answer. She's absolutely right. I mean, it's actually one of those questions that you actually wonder: is there some kind of subtext to it, because every country in the world trades with China. Now, the word used for Africa is dependency. But I think what it is that there's a fear of having closer relationships with China than with the West. So it's dressed up as dependency. But I mean, countries like mine, like Zimbabwe, which is under, you know, whether you want to call them coercive measures, unilateral sanctions, or whatever it is, from some Western countries, well, of course, they're going to go to turn to those countries that tend not to ask too many uncomfortable questions. Of course, it just happens. And we saw this in the Cold War, you know, this idea of spheres of influence. So I'm actually surprised that the question comes up so many times, not only because, you know, the US and the EU, they do trade with China, but also because surely it goes without saying that, you know, if a country is unpopular with one part of the world, they're going to naturally try to make friends with another part of the world.
No, but you're absolutely right. Of course, the whole world trades with China, and this is up to discussion. The point was rather, and I spoke to a Kenyan colleague about this, that some of, not only the trade, but some of the investments that are being done with China leads to high debt that has to be repaid. And that is, of course, the aspect that can lead to a dependence.
If I may just add, Cecilia, to why is it, well, one of the things around increased trade with China is when you look at, say, the FOCAC funding that was announced then, you know, there's a really big aspect of trade facilitation on it, a big focus on trade facilitation, big focus on industrial development, SEZs and so forth. And this is something that hasn't been included, particularly when you look at Prosper Africa with the US, you know. And so if there is more capacity building, more facilitation, financing from China, then ordinarily a country that is looking to grow its trade and looking to attract more investment is going to go where there is facilitation. But that said, when you look at the overall, say, FDI flow and trade, Europe is still a big partner to Africa. The US is still a big partner to Africa. China, even by FDI sums, is still trailing below the US and the EU. So it's not as if there's been this very drastic shift of trade and investment coming out of China. Now, when we talk about loans, that is a completely different ball game altogether. But the FOCAC financing in itself isn't all loans. And there's a very big aspect of trade facilitation. And many countries have tapped into the opportunity to build their special economic zones through some of those commitments that were made by China.
Thank you for that. We did have a few questions on China in the Q&A and others that I think you answered. Let me take a few from there. There is one asking how we touched upon it, but if you want to develop how the WTO and United Nations and other international organizations can support trade in Africa, and how what kind of improved collaboration these organizations, such as job creation for youth and women, and what is, and then there's a China question as well, several of them here, but you've answered this. You touched upon it a little bit, especially Petina on the WTO, but is there more? You mentioned digital trade, where that has to be, both of you did, digital trade has to be broadened also to see how it can facilitate for the African continent to penetrate the digital economy. Is there anything else you think that WTO, United Nations and the other international organizations can do more specifically to support African integration per se, but also the African integration in the global trading system?
Yeah, you know, the UNDP has proved to be a very good friend to the AfCFTA. They've given project funding for some of our key programs, and I think they are the key multilateral partner on the youth and women program. I would have to double check that, but I think the UNDP has been extremely helpful.
Yeah, right.
The WTO, I would say that the WTO at the moment should probably focus on the WTO rather than fixing or assisting with regional trade arrangements. But what the WTO could do, because the AU is already an observer in the WTO, and I think the AfCFTA should be an observer in the WTO as well, especially in those technical committees where the WTO agreements have been made part of the legal framework. But beyond that, honestly, with all of the work that the WTO is doing, I don't really see much that they can do concretely to support the AfCFTA, but perhaps Bogolo could have other ideas. But Cecilia, I also wanted to just quickly pick up on a very interesting question that I've just seen in the chat, and that's the question of trade facilitation.
Yes, I was going to come to that. Yes, please.
Okay, all right. So
yes,
we'll come to that
you go.
Okay, thank you so much for that question on trade facilitation, because it helps to understand partly, apart from the issue of export markets and commodities and so on, why there's so little intra-African trade. Africa is ginormous, it's huge. I mean, to get to West Africa, to East Africa by road is really, really difficult, right? So you fly, you can't even take a ship because you then have to go to Southern Africa first to go upwards. And, you know, to get, or you can even go through the Suez Canal. So it is such a massively large continent with a very poor road network and even worse, a poor rail network. So I think one of the things that at the individual African country level, and perhaps this can be taken up at the regional level, really the question of infrastructure. We need to think about infrastructure, and we need to think about just the basic logistics of how to get products moving across such a vast continent, which of course is where, you know, there's advantage to digital trade. There's advantage to trade in services, because then you don't have these infrastructural gridlocks that you face when you are transporting actual goods and products. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. And another question came up about this as well, the importance of, you know, the actual physical transport projects. You mentioned that rail, road, etc., and then the more digital infrastructure that needs to be there for border crossing and digitalization of customs and so on. And this, of course, makes the work of the African Union and the AfCFTA so much broader than just focusing on trade and making it, you know, a very big responsibilities to do that, because it is indeed a huge continent. But I guess this is also discussed when the heads of states meet in the African Union, how that can be integrated in a more sort of holistic view on how to facilitate trade. Bogolo, did you want to comment on this? Otherwise, there's another question that has to do, you mentioned the different regional projects and the different special economic zones. And there's a question, how does special economic zones fit into the AfCFTA, consider they are given special incentives and are largely occupied by firms outside the continent?
I don't know if Bogolo wants to take that, but you know, one of the last things I did before I left Accra was to work on a ministerial declaration on special economic zones, because as the questioner is very right, there are special zones within each country which have special incentives and so on. So of course, one of the issues is that if products are manufactured within those zones, do they get AfCFTA preferences and rules of origin? Because they will have an advantage, won't they, over other products manufactured in outside those export processing zones. So it's still very much a conversation that is going on at the moment in the AfCFTA, how to deal with the products of economic zones. Because what you then have, of course, in these products is you have a lot of investments, right, from our friends, the Chinese, for instance, right? But are they effectively Chinese products being manufactured in Africa, or are they African products being manufactured with Chinese funding? So all of those questions around how you deal with products that have benefited from particular incentives that then are sent out into the AfCFTA regime without some kind of circumvention, I think that needs to be looked at more closely. Thank you.
So, the special economic zones in relation to AfCFTA has always been a heated issue, because it's similar to subsidized products and so forth. But, you know, when we were arguing for recognition of SEZ produced Okay, I'm going to move this closer so you can hear me a little better. So when we were arguing for recognition of SEZ-produced projects, we were thinking that there has to be a very strong focus on rules of origin as well. Because some SEZs, they bring products already with a lot of value add, and all you have to do is stick in the wheels. If it's a VAG, you just stick in the wheels and you say that this is Botswana produced. But we had to, we were recommending that we have to look very strongly at the rules of origin and value that has been added within the country domestically in order to term the product locally made. And there was a question also, Cecilia, about how we work with our other partners, US and Europe. You know, the AfCFTA is not about Africa only, it's about Africa's relation with the rest of the world as well. And there are many opportunities. And we wrote a paper when Biden came to office pointing out that he has to think about Africa's ambitions as he thinks about the US-Africa strategy and policy. And one of the Africa's ambitions is the AfCFTA. So as AGOA reaches its sunset years, the thinking around a US-Africa trade has to be associated with the AfCFTA. But of course, we know that they've started engaging with China, with Kenya, as an example, on a more bilateral level. But we do not think that that should be the case anymore, that we have the AfCFTA. And as we also think about investment, facilitation between Europe and Africa, the thinking has to be around the standardized modes that we have created in the continent that we hope will create a lot more clarity, and we hope will give a lot more credibility and efficiency to investing in the continent. That is the whole purpose of the AfCFTA, and we hope that the interface with the rest of the world will be simplified in such a way.
Thank you so much. We have run out of time. Unfortunately, this is such a huge subject. There are so many different aspects we could have digged into. But thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, experience, and vision. You take care of that voice, Bogolo. I can see how you're suffering. Thank you for joining us anyway. Thank you, Petina, as well. We look forward to reading that book about your journey with the containers when that comes out, maybe a new episode in Trade Wins when you can present it. Thank you all of you who have listened and follow us. Have a good night, good afternoon, or good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Cecilia. Thanks, Petina. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. I actually